Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today as part of the SCCGR's seminar in Justice Futures. I'm really pleased to have Phil Crockett Thomas joining us today to talk about her research. Phil's a lecturer at the University of Stirling and also writes fiction and poetry, and I'm really looking forward to the talk. Just to explain the format. Phil will talk for about 30 minutes and then we'll open up the session for the remaining 25 minutes or so for conversation and any questions and answers. So I think that's about it, apart from saying that we are recording the session, just so you know, and I'll hand over to you, Phil, if that sounds okay.
Um, can everyone see my slides? Can you see?
Yes, they're great.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Kelly. Just okay. Um, so yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much to the SECGR for inviting me to give this presentation. And thanks for joining me when I'm sure everyone is more than ready for a holiday. I know I definitely am. Okay, so my talk is going to be based on an article I published in the Sociological Review last year. And I've only got 30 minutes, so there's much more in the paper than I'll be able to talk about today. But just to give you a brief outline, I'm going to speak about the ideas and approach underpinning my project Prison Break, and then discuss a few of the stories created by participants. And I'm really delighted. I just noticed in the guest that one of the participants is here, so hey Lizzie. And I'm going to talk about these stories focusing on the theme of utopia, with a little side helping of reflections on world building from some new work I'm currently developing. So Prison Break used creative writing workshops to support activists and scholars involved in prison abolition and transformative justice work in the UK to write short works of science fiction imagining more just futures. And these were published in Abolition Science Fiction, which you can see on the screen, which was an open access book, which also contained discussion chapters, which drew on participants' collective analysis of the stories that we did in the workshops, relating them to current debates and learning within the movement for abolition. And importantly, the book was designed to support readers hoping to undertake their own creative explorations of justice issues. So it includes discussion prompts, creative writing exercises, and suggestions on how you might organize a workshop similar to the ones that we used in the project. Yeah, so it was really designed to outlive the 1 year time span of the project and outlive my involvement in it. And it's been really exciting to see the book being used in this way all over the world, and translated into different languages. And we've got an Italian translation coming out quite soon. And actually, in the Italian translation, the translators have written their own stories in response to some of the prompts. Okay, so the movement for prison abolition seeks to reduce or eliminate prisons and other punitive social practices and replace them with approaches to social harm and conflict that center on responsibility and healing rather than on punishment and exclusion. However, as Angela Davis comments, the prison is considered so natural that it's extremely hard to imagine life without it. As such, those who advocate for prison abolition are often dismissed as unrealistic or naive, about what could replace the systems we currently have, about public support for punitive and retributive justice, policies, or about human nature. However, in a recent book, Anna Tawell has argued that abolitionism is a realist because it starts from the empirical reality of punishment as a sort of lawful harm, and the lived experience of the people disproportionately subject to it. And so this is a realism that affirms the possibility of revolutionary change, rather than a pessimistic version of realism where we're bound to repeat the status quo. And I find this really helpful for where we're coming from in this project. Also important to say that the movement for abolition is heterogeneous, and informed by different histories, experiences, and theories. For example, you've got legacy from the anarchist-informed abolition in Scandinavia in the 1960s and 70s. You've got the long-running engagement with abolition within Quakerism. You've got the Black Panthers and other political prisoners in the 1970s in the US. the development of the concepts of the sort of prison industrial complex analysis, which comes around at the time of massive prison expansion in the US, or the work of Crip and MAD activists for the deinstitutionalization of asylums in the 1960s and 70s. And of course, the experience of these groups and their really varied ideas about strategy, the legitimacy of violence, and the role of the state, for example, really inform the movement today, which is diverse and, yeah, heterogeneous, as I say. And of course, the movement also continues to change in response to the times. So when we undertook the project, the movement was garnering mainstream attention, which was kind of quite unique. And this was inspired both by the Black Lives Matter movement, and I'd also argue that the experience that many people had of how their sort of day-to-day reality had changed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Maybe inviting them to reflect on having to live within rules or being confined to a certain space, perhaps also drove people's interest in thinking about prison abolition. Today in the UK, I'd argue that there's much more focus on political prisoners, and this is the new kind of group, I guess, of political prisoners that's been created by the increasing authoritarianism of the state in the last kind of two consecutive governments, and also the international movement for solidarity with Palestine. I think it's fair to say that we would write different stories if we undertook the project today. So abolitionist scholars and activists are really explicit about the challenge of imagining and developing alternative visions and practices of justice when you're engaged in resisting ongoing state violence. So as such, a key objective of the project was to really create an environment where my participants felt able to explore their knowledge in creative ways and to flex their anti-carceral imagination. And while I work in the social sciences, my first degree was in the arts, and I've got an ongoing creative practice, primarily through creative writing, that I incorporate into my research and teaching. So for this project, I designed and facilitated creative writing workshops, and I worked with 28 activists and scholars from across the UK. Some workshops were in person and some were online. And the workshops comprised of a mix of reading and discussion based on a resource I created that you can see on the screen that contains quotes and extracts on the theme of abolition and utopia. And also creative writing exercises, which were designed to help develop different writing skills and to explore the project's themes. And then after the workshops, we met as a whole group for a sharing symposium, which was really exciting, to discuss and celebrate the 14 stories, manifesto, and poem that were finished and included in the publication. So I've worked with creative writing in various ways in my research, but in this project, I've really focused on fiction as a verb, so fictioning. So the way that the writing and reading of fiction, particularly in collaboration with others, can open up a space to imagine the world anew, and in doing so, transform our practices in the present. And in order to conceptualize collaborative fictioning, I've drawn on the work of the art scholars David Burrows and Simon O'Sullivan, who, inspired by Deleuze and particularly his notion of fabulation, describe one of the functions of fictioning to be mythopoesis, which is a kind of address to the future that might generate a people to come or help build new worlds. So as such, Prison Break also sought to investigate the role that fictioning could play in the sort of dialectical move between imagination and praxis, which is articulated by Ernst Bloch. So while art-based methods are not unproblematic or free of the potential for harm, I found that fictioning has ethical affordances for working with people who have stigmatized knowledge. For example, in the telling of different stories from those privileged or demanded by the state, or fictioning can be used to create composite characters that can act as proxies for difficult experiences, thus minimizing the pressure to share traumatic personal stories in a way that feels exposing. So collaborative fictioning has meant reading, writing, and thinking with others, building something new together. And, of course, as in all research, there's power imbalances between myself and the researchers, between myself and the participants, who were also researchers in this project, and also between each other. So I think feminist critiques of social science methods being underpinned by exploitative or extractive logics is well founded. So in this project, fiction really functioned as a way for participants to control if and how to reveal information. For example, they only shared the writing they wanted to with the project. I didn't kind of collect up people's notes. Okay, so Joan Horan has used the term imagine activism to describe how activist communities are formed, inspired, and or reinvigorated by fictional cultural production. My project is really deeply indebted to contemporary activist approaches that have embraced fiction, and particularly speculative and science fiction and creative writing. And the most well-known publication resulting from this activist work is the speculative fiction anthology Octavia's Brood, named in honor of the Black feminist writer Octavia E. Butler and created by social justice activists and community organizers in the US. So many writers of science fiction have argued that the genre can actually tell us more about the present than the future. For example, you get Samuel Delany writing that science fiction's relation to the present is one of dialogic, contestatory, agonistic creativity. And he says, in science fiction, the future is only a writerly convention that allows the science fiction writer to indulge in a significant distortion of the present that sets up a rich and complex dialogue with the readers here and now. So in other words, this distortion is an estrangement of the real world, and it invites the reader to kind of reflect that other worlds are indeed possible. So the editors of Octavia's Brood, Adrienne Maree Brown and Walida Imarisha, they describe that activism as a form of science fiction because of the way it entails moving beyond the boundaries of what seems realistic or possible. And as Brown describes, collaborative fictioning acted as a safe exploring ground to explore difficult issues without serious worldly consequences. However, they both emphasize that this is not a choice between imagination and practice. It's not a kind of retreat from the world. Instead, it's a sort of dialectical process where both aspects are indispensable. And you can see the link here to Bloch's remarks on imagination and praxis in that dialectic. However, despite the embrace of speculative fiction between some in the movement for prison abolition, there's often ambivalence expressed about the concept of utopia. So, for example, we can see in Abolition Feminism Now, Angela Davis and her co-authors write, abolition is by necessity speculative, and we ardently embrace its utopian dimension. Yet, if a movement is framed as a progress towards abolition, its conceptual and organizing moves can also reinforce a central myth about abolition, that it is impractical, unobtainable, a dream. Utopian approaches can be cast as limited, and it's a frame too often leveled against abolitionists, along with our evangelical zeal, our naivety, and our failure to be pragmatic, and our extremism. End quote. So while agreeing that in one sense the utopian is energizing and to be embraced, the authors are concerned that the project of abolition will become contaminated by the popular prejudice against utopia, which will dissuade people from the cause. And activist scholars also importantly ruminate on the harm utopia can do within movements for social justice. So a really good example of this, I think, is the work of Molly Ackhurst, who cautions against the distress that can be caused or that can be experienced by activists believing that they can, end violence and harm and realize that utopia are free from these things. So, perhaps utopia sometimes acts as an attachment that can wound, as in Laurent Ballant's conception of cruel optimism. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cough. However, as the literary theorist Tom Moylan argues, the conceptualization of utopia as a perfect society has long been delegitimized by its implication in authoritarian regimes and genocides. But it was recast in a sort of subversive form in the 1960s via the work of writers like Natalie Le Guin and Sam Delaney, buoyed by the time's social movements for racial, sexual, and gender equality. And these writers and their readers rejected, in Moylan's words, utopia as a blueprint while preserving it as a dream. And he said that they created critical utopias that perform their own contradictions. So drawing on the work of contemporary utopian scholars such as Davina Cooper and Ruth Levitas, within the project we worked with this conceptualization of utopia as critical, as something that's processual, consisting of fragments, experiments, and failures. And Moylan's concept of the critical utopia also influenced the project's methodological approach. So in the workshops were in two parts, and at the end of each part, I ran a longer writing exercise, which I adapted from Michael Dearwater, who's a science fiction scholar and writer. And in this exercise, people had to come up with an innovation that meant prisons, or if they fancied it, punishment no longer existed, or that would sort of significantly change the way we respond to harm and conflict. And this idea drew on the literary theorist Darko Suvin's concept of the novum, which he actually also borrowed from Ernst Bloch. So the novum is a sort of new thing. It's an innovation or a phenomenon presented in a fictional world that estranges the author or the reader's perspective on the real world. So in our project, participants came up with nova such as prisoners become able to walk through walls, bodies can be physically contained, but consciousness can be downloaded into a new body, or due to kind of total or near total human extinction, prisons become an unaffordable luxury and all conflict has to be worked through. And then they wrote scenes or stories set in this future from the perspective of an alien visitor, which is a really long-running sci-fi narrative device and very fun to play with. So the second time I ran the exercise with each group, there was an additional challenge. So this time we had to think of a sort of unintended effect or consequence of your novum. And this edition was partly a device to bring dynamics into the plots that people were developing, but also in inviting the consideration of unintended effects or problems, it encouraged the development of critical utopias. And I mean, this is also, I was thinking about this as a way of kind of attempting to preemptively do away with the overwhelm or the paralysis of the task of, solving the problem of prison or punishment by incorporating problems or imperfections or unintended consequences into the plot. And I thought that this would allow us to think with the stories rather than sort of get fixated on their focus as a sort of, get fixated on their failure as a sort of perfect utopia. So I'm now going to discuss a few of the stories created by project participants. I love talking about these stories. It's a shame I can't talk about them all. You can read the book. It's free. I should have said that at the start. You can just download it from the Abolition Science Fiction.org website. Yeah, it's available as a PDF and an audiobook. Okay. So anyway, so I'm going to talk about some of these stories, particularly in relation to the theme of utopia, and yeah, also talk a little bit about world building. So briefly, by world building in fiction, I'm referring to the sort of creative world, the created world where a story takes place. So everything the characters experience, for example, in terms of their culture, the nature, customs, and places that they're encountering in that world, in that story world. And I noticed, world building has also been increasingly invoked within activism as a description for the work that activists do, perhaps in place or alongside older terms like community building or sort of prefiguration. So, for example, drawing on the work of the philosopher and activist Maria Lugones, Nat Raha and Mika van der Drift described their experience of abolitionist, transfeminist, activist world building as in the face of duress, solidarity, friendship, political actions, and creativity between queer and trans femmes and folks more broadly create spaces for openness and becoming. We understand this as world making or worlding. In a world, different senses of meaning, history, people, narratives, and insights are brought together. A world doesn't need to be complete, but it is lived and shared. So I really like this quote. I love this book. I recommend it to everyone because it's a sort of evolutionary or evolving and kind of prefigurative becoming together, where new norms and values are being sort of co-created through messy experimentation. And I've been thinking about how experiences of world building and activism influence the stories that we tell and vice versa. So the sci-fi author Ben Winters reminds us not to forget that in world building, the language of law and policy does a special kind of work. and that its power permeates our lives in ways large and small, whether or not we're paying attention. So this is in a piece that he's writing advice to people who are science fiction writers, focusing on how to build coherent and believable worlds. So for an example of this, the story The Monument by Dave from the collection takes place in a world where policing has been abolished. The protagonist, a former cop, now works as a municipal heritage officer patrolling a monument to former police. So I'll read you a little extract. Dave writes, the word abolition appeared nowhere in official documentation, being referred to variously as the cessation of outmoded practices, the redistribution of limited resources, and most commonly simply the reforms. The names of those killed in the riots or tortured in police stations are not included on the monument. It was only by avowing that the officers had faithfully discharged the duties demanded of them by society up until the point that these duties were no longer required that the political settlement could be maintained. So here, Dave uses the language of policy and bureaucracy, ironically, for comedic effect. But as Kara Jardine, another participant in the project, noted, the use of this discourse makes the story world and indeed a real world without police seem more plausible, if dystopian. And I think it's really interesting that Dave's story doesn't really have a novum. So policing was abolished, but we don't really know why the practices became seen as outmoded. And I think this mystery and also the use of sort of real world terms really evokes the dangers of carceral practices like policing and imprisonment continuing under another name, and invites us to attend to the carceral and exclusionary practices in our day-to-day life. So I want to think a little bit about utopia in their stories. And for this, I'm drawing on Ursula Le Guin. So Le Guin was thinking with Taoist philosophy, and she argued that the dominant historical model of utopia has been what she called the Big Yang motorcycle trip. And she characterized this as qualitatively sort of bright, dry, clear, strong, active, aggressive, progressive, creative, and hot, among other things. And she contrasts this with a sort of playful proposal for a yin utopia, which could counter the dominant yang. And this, she says, could be, among other things, dark, wet, obscure, passive, participatory, circular, peaceful, nurturant, and cold. And I think you can see the sort of yang utopian impulse in several of the project stories, where the catalyst from abolition comes from incarcerated people and a prison riot or overthrow, and its kind of impact then hopefully, rippling out across society. And I think this emphasizes the importance of the agency of incarcerated people and the inspiration drawn from their resistance for abolitionists today. And also, like, as a good example of this sort of yang utopia, I want to think about Prison Planet 824 by Richard C. Coram. I'm actually going to read you the whole piece as it's so short, and I think we have time. So 200 crypto suits moved across the docking bay, perfectly synchronized, marching to a rhythm programmed many light years away. Inside one suit, Rannoch eased his body into the motion as he'd long learned to do, his eyes darting around, scanning the new landscape as his body contorted to the rhythm of the suit. He felt it stop, saw a large stage in front of him with a few people on it, fiddling with a microphone, suitless. These must be the wardens of Prison Planet 824. As one of them stepped up to the lectern, he felt a sensation at the back of his spine, something he'd not felt before. Friends, the voice said, you are about to experience an unusual feeling. Please don't be alarmed. This is us releasing the bind on your crypto suit. You may fall or collapse. We will help you back up. Rannoch blinked fast, his breathing short. A horrible joke? But as the voice continued, he felt his body loosen from the vice of the suit. My name is Adel, the voice continued. I'm one of the outworld communicators here. Our job is to maintain the fiction to the old world that this prison still operates as they founded it. Every few decades, they send us some new inmates, you. My job is to explain to you all that you're now free, while convincing the origin world that you're not. We once stood where you are until we dispelled the wardens. Now, I'll tell you how that happened. So Richard's story was inspired by how often the problem of how to respond to social harm in sci-fi is sort of off-worlded to another planet. So, for example, you could think of Robert Heinlein's novel The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And this also echoes the common practice in the real world of situating prisons in rural areas or otherwise hidden from view. And as Koshka Duff, one of the participants in the project, noted, the secret freedom of the prisoners brings to mind real liberation struggles around gender and sexuality. And to quote Koshka, the kinds of freedom that are dependent on convincing some powerful others that you're not experiencing that freedom. And I want to think about this with Davina Cooper's concept of everyday utopias. So Cooper's described everyday utopias as the networks and spaces where people experiment with different ways of being together and performing daily life. So this is a prefigurative form of politics, and Cooper's really interested in where people actualize or make real their utopian ideals, or try to. So Koshka's reflection about hidden freedom in the story really reminded me of Cooper's comment that, in a sense, everyday utopias are social black holes, absorbing those who enter but missing from the prevailing maps of their field. And this might be due to them being too small to notice, or because they don't want to be found by the wrong people. But, you know, activist worlds are not always hidden or off the map. Worlds get thrust into the spotlight, or the social-political context may necessitate participating in other worlds. For example, in their discussion of transfeminist activism and futures, Raha and Vanderdrift contend that it's not enough to demand rights or to get institutions to recognize and no violence for it to end. However, you know, sometimes it's necessary to navigate institutions and systems to get the things we need, and of the need to consider our complicity and agency within this. So further, they recognise that activists are world-making under the conditions of neoliberalism and austerity, and within racist, sexist, and capitalist regimes and institutions. And as such, there's no position of innocence or purity that can be spoken from. There's no kind of real outside or true escape from implication in the structures of power. But this doesn't mean that there isn't space to play, that there isn't space for resistance and disidentification. So, for example, in the story I just read you, the liberated prison planet participates in the fiction. It tells the home planet what it wants to hear in order to preserve its autonomy. In contrast, Day 62 on Earth by Jess Poyner is set on a future planet Earth within a colony of the descendants of the scanty survivors of the terrifyingly named eugenics wars. Can't wait for that. And this narrative is told from the perspective of an honoured alien visitor who reports on how the colony handles social harm and conflict without the use of punishment or prisons, which is a contrast to their own society. So Jess writes, so at a certain age, generally around the age of 12, a child can choose a naming day where they may present their past, present, and future selves to their community. For some children, this happens once in their life. For most, the time of inward reflection and contemplation of self and relationships to their community is rehashed continuously and celebrated once every 5 years or so after their first self-naming day. So the novum here is that the colony is founded on the principle that, to quote Jess, life is sacred, life is interdependent, and life is growth, end quote. And this knowledge gleaned from catastrophic loss has led them to develop rituals where the community periodically gathers to offer praise and suggestions for growth, i.e. constructive criticism to each other. So this society could perhaps be seen to embody certain elements of Le Guin's characterization of yin utopias, particularly the idea of kind of the participatory, the cyclical, the peaceful, and the nurturant. For example, in its response to a character who does things that cause harm to others, one of our project participants, Chris Rossdale, dubbed the inconvenient person, Jess shared that, you know, the story was actually partially inspired by the complexities of real intentional community building and the experience of those who don't fit within radical groups. So in the story, instead of excluding this character, the others engage in a process of dialogue and accountability. And the story really reflects the sort of abolitionist argument that no one is disposable. And I think this attitude is sort of literalized in the story, as there's so few people left that they can't be wasted through imprisonment. And as Chris also commented, that account of a story that's gotten rid of prisons and is doing justice differently, we expect to be written about in quite a sort of affirming and extolatory ways. But in that moment, abolition is experienced as tragedy. Carcerality is a luxury that society can't afford. So, however, the colony does also aim to show its alien visitor the superiority of their approach to justice. So although the story fits with some of the characteristics of yin utopias as described by Le Guin, it's also yang in its creativity, its clarity, and its action. So Le Guin is really clear in her essay that the problem of utopia is not going to be saved by the yin utopia replacing the yang. She contends that it's as hard to reach the utopia by going backwards, which is how she characterizes the yin utopia, as it is to keep going forwards, which is how she sort of sees the yang. Instead, she proposes forging a path roundabout or sideways that balances the two. And I was started thinking about this as a sort of not using a sort of binary either or, but rather as a sort of thinking about the and thinking about therefore what an and utopia would be like. So I'm kind of going to wrap up now. So yeah, so the and utopia is a kind of productive contradiction. I think it emphasizes action and rest, trying and failing, fighting and compromising. And in these sort of tensions and the sense of indeterminacy, the and utopia is inhabitable for everyone, even if it's not always comfortable. And the sense of and is also evident in the way that abolitionists world build, with a sense of temporality which oscillates between present, near future, and distant future. And you know, in the present, that might mean working with others to foster everyday utopias, to build them, or to practice a sort of everyday abolition that, according to Sarah Lamble, is attentive to forms of carcerality and exclusion in our daily lives. And this world building is really important and sustaining, and also done in the knowledge that the change one seeks might not come within one's lifetime. So abolitionists stress, or tend to stress, that their aim is not to remove prisons from society without also attending to other carceral institutions and practices. And a crucial aspect of this is how we imagine and enact anti-carceral ways of living and organizing ourselves in the present against the dominant carceral logic. So I think, as you can see in the maps that we made together during the workshop, there's an example of on the screen. I think that this demonstrates that, you know, building a world without prisons entails a shift away from the prison as the sort of central problem, to focus on the social arrangements, the material conditions and values of the world that we want to make. And this means that abolition is not a sort of destroying everything and starting over, rather that, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore argues, that, you know, abolition is not absence, it's a presence. So what the world will be already exists in fragments and pieces, experiments and possibilities. Abolition is building the future from the present in all the ways that we can. So this rejection of the sort of perfect future, no place in favor of a practice of experimentation and bricolage in the present, I think also echoes Thomas Mathiassen's claim that the alternative lies in the finished, in the sketch, in what is not yet fully existing. So Mathiassen was really concerned with trying to develop alternatives to punishment that would be credible, so i.e. not totally foreign to the system that it was trying to replace, but also contradictory and retaining a sense of openness and indeterminacy that means that these alternatives can't easily be co-opted and de-radicalized by the states. So I think, you know, indeterminacy really emerges as a sort of key theme in both utopia and world building, a sort of maybe a sort of strategic indeterminacy. And the worlds created in the stories also reflect the difference in what people involved in the movement for abolition think the role of the state should be in a more just future. So, you know, if your abolition is anarchist informed, you might worry that abolishing prisons would mean the state develops other carceral forms and institutions, and you can see this fear in the story The Monument. Or you might imagine mutual aid programs, or communities away from state interference, as in Prison Planet 824. If your abolition is informed or partially informed by socialism, you might see a role for some kind of radically reimagined democratic states without prisons, or even with, you know, really minimal facilities of confinement. So perhaps Day 62 fits here, perhaps not. And I'd really like to think more about this, looking at examples as well from beyond the project. But finally, to return to the question of the dialectic between imagination and practice, within the project, I think collaborative fictioning really created a space for activist scholars to pursue a path sort of sideways, creating and utopias, to offer critiques and imagine otherwise, to explore complex feelings and ideas about justice and punishment, and to produce narratives that generate dialogue, help sustain hope and inspire action. And the stories that they created demonstrate that activists are not, abolitionists are not, you know, primarily inspired by perfect utopias, but by sort of critical utopias, which reflect the complexity that they see in their movements. Thanks. I'm gonna turn the next page to the references. And I'll stop sharing in a sec.
Oh, lots of applause there, Phil. Thank you so much for such a rich talk. It was really interesting to hear about your work and see some of the really amazing fictions that have emerged from your project. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Hi, everyone.